Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, a podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In this second installment of our two-part discussion with Stephen Nagy on the challenges China poses to the international rules-based order and how Canada can play a role in the shifting geopolitical order, we cover the impact of China's ascent on Western influence, the need for Canada to embrace a more pragmatic and interest-based foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific based on principles of neo-middle power diplomacy, and the necessity of maintaining cooperative relations with China. This is the Expert Series. Does the rise of China necessarily signify the potential decline of Western influence?
So my view, the rise of China is probably a net good. It's a net good because what we've done is the Chinese government has transitioned 500, 600 million people out of utter poverty into a position where they can start to consume and produce goods. And we benefit directly as Canadians for that, as Westerners for that. China, because of its immense resources, is a critical partner in dealing with climate change, probably regulating AI, probably thinking about new solutions to the climate change challenges that we're facing. I think that China has a huge potential to have positive impact and development as well. So, I think that to think that China is not, and China's rise comes at the loss of the so-called West, I think that this is probably not a productive way to think about China's rise. It does face challenges, and the challenge of China's rise is mostly due to the nature of its government, its oppressive tendencies, its human rights violations, and it has a very different view about how it thinks about security, how it thinks about international institutions, and we should not mince our words. It wants to change international institutions so they're less rules based. So things like human rights are not universal. So when we think about rule of law is not something that they are advocating for. They advocate for rule by law. So I think that there is some huge benefits from China's rise. There's some real challenges of China's rise. And this has less to do with the decline of the West, but the rise of the West, or the rest. And this is really important. It's the so-called post-World War II order that has allowed the rest to rise, to be more prosperous, to be more stable, to be able to feed and deal with food security issues. So in a sense, the rise of the rest has been because of the so-called West. And I think that this is an important thing for us to continue to focus on as we advocate for the current system that we enjoy.
What kind of international actor should Canada be? What kind of international actor are we at present? Is it too late for us to play a substantive role in shaping the global order in the medium term? And building off that, how do we face up to the geopolitical realities of today?
I'm not going to say what I think of Canada. I would like to emphasize how I think some of our allies and friends may be thinking about Canada as a global player. And what we often hear is from friends in the region is Canada has a decadent foreign policy, that it's a little bit detached from the region's priorities, and that it doesn't have the expertise that it needs to engage in the region in a sustained, meaningful, and results-oriented way. And I think that this is a really, really interesting contrast for us to think about from, let's say, the Japanese and the Australians that I think have moved away from normative approaches to middle power diplomacy, so focusing on human rights and human security, the right to protect kinds of issues in countries. And they've really moved towards a very pragmatic, realist-based or interest-based approach to how they engage in the region. So that's a non-zero-sum approach. Is this the way Canada should go? I personally think this is the way that Canada should go. We need to be thinking about what does the region want? What are the comparative advantages that we can deploy in the region? And here I mentioned energy security and critical mineral security as key areas, or trade advocacy. I think that these are things that the region wants and that would make Canada have an impactful, stable, sustainable, and meaningful role that not only benefits the region, but benefits Canada and Canadians and our national interests. I often hear criticisms about some of the more value-laden policies within the region, and I think this continues to be a problem. I think the progressive policy we have back at home are great, and I'm very wedded to them personally. But I think that they don't fly very well in the region because they have serious security problems, and that is their priority. So maybe that Canada needs to listen to some of the voices of those the regional players, and again think about what does the region want, what are the kinds of interests that we need to secure in the region, and what resources we need to deploy. So in that sense, I'm a big advocate of what I call neo-middle power diplomacy, where we focus on result-oriented, realistic, pragmatic, ad hoc coalitions with other middle powers to achieve concrete objectives within the region. And this could be insulating each other from economic coercion. It could be pushing the United States to take different choices on trade policy. Let's get them back into the TPP, or let's advocate for a new TPP that suits some of the domestic agenda in the United States. Let's work with on AI regulation. Let's think about how we can work on denuclearization. Let's think about how middle powers can work together on cybersecurity in terms of confidence building measures, but also capability building measures. So there's a lot there, but you probably noticed I didn't talk a lot about human rights or human security or the right to protect, because I think that in an era of great power competition between US and China, that we need to insulate ourselves from this competition, but also ensure that we're shaping how these two states behave. And that again requires a very pragmatic and realistic approach. I think your listeners are probably wondering, Asia, Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, what's the difference? Why are we focusing on the Indo-Pacific now? And I think from the Canadian interest is that the center of gravity of the global economy is in this region that stretches from the Western Indian Ocean through the Eastern Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Pacific. This is where the biggest middle-class populations are emerging. That means consumers of Canadian products, Canadian energy, Canadian agricultural products, energy, critical minerals. So a lot of our wealth will be derived from this region, and that means we need to be engaged in the region. At the same time, there are a lot of hotspots within the region, whether it's Taiwan or the Korean Peninsula, the Senkaku Islands, South China Sea, or the Himalayan Plateau between India and China. And it's really important that Canada keeps their eyes on these issues, because if something happens within the region, it could disrupt the whole region's economy, and this will have a spillover effect on Canada. Just to give you some numbers, about 5.5 trillion US dollars goes through from the Indian Ocean through the Malabar Straits from Singapore, through the South China Sea up towards China and Japan and Korea. That's a lot. And if this does if there's a disruption because of a kinetic conflict, that this will impact Canadian people. And you might be saying, well, what happens over there doesn't really matter. Actually, it does. If critical minerals are shut off, if semiconductors are shut off because of conflict, how will this affect the Japanese and Korean corporations that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadian citizens in their automobile companies in Ontario? So we're deeply connected. And I think that Canadians need to learn and have a much better understanding about the Indo-Pacific region and what it means for Canadians, how our national interests are wedded to the region, and how we need to continue to invest in the region.
Is Canada willing to risk economic and diplomatic fallout by taking a principled stand against China's reunification efforts, potentially disrupting its own trade relationships and strategic partnerships? Can Canada effectively advocate for a peaceful resolution to the Taiwan question, while simultaneously benefiting from China's economic largesse and contributing to its rise?
Well, I think that we should read the Chinese tea leaves about what Chinese leaders have consistently said about Taiwan, is that they prioritize a peaceful reunification and that they don't give up the right to use force. We should read the Chinese tea leaves and see that this is a priority issue for them, that they continue to have flexibility in terms of how countries engage with Taiwan as a political entity through the One China policy, as long as they're not advocating for independence or calling Taiwan a nation state or welcoming their president to to Ottawa to speak in front of our parliament. So I think there's a lot of ways that we continue to engage with China, but at the same time ensure that the reunification process, if it happens on terms that the Taiwanese and the Chinese agree upon together. It is something between them. I think also we need to be thinking creatively how we can work with Taiwan to deal with global issues. And I think that the new Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy is interesting because it finds ways to work with Taiwan and New Zealand and Australia on indigenous issues, on climate change, and some economic issues at the non-state level. So I think these are it's a way to have our cake and eat it too in terms of how we want to benefit from China's trade. We want to make sure that peace and stability continues across the Taiwan Straits. At the same time, we maintain our One China policy.
How can Canada overcome the perception that it lacks the ambition to think big and play a more assertive role in international relations? And what step can the country take to ensure that it's not only seen as nice, but also as a strong and influential player in global affairs, especially the Indo-Pacific?
Okay, so I think what's an important thing to be thinking about is that this is not a liberal versus conservative or a Trudeau versus Harper discussion. I think Canadian foreign policy since the 2000s has not been on the forefront of, I think, proactive advocacy of certain issues aside from human security. So it sounds like, or my understanding, it's somewhat systematic, and that means that we need to have a reality check of how we want to be engaging in the world. So this, I think that realization is important. Second, an accounting of what kinds of resources we have and how do we want to deploy them to solve the issues that are facing Canada, but also I think the issues facing some of our partners. So let's do kind of a whirlwind approach. Ukraine is one. I think Taiwan is another issue. I think broader institutional paucity in the Indo-Pacific region, and maybe the Korean Peninsula and North Korea are some issues that I think Canada can provide some resources to. On the Ukrainian front, training, providing some arms to the Ukrainians are some key things that I think Canada can do to increase their credibility. Thinking about this in terms of not months, but years, and providing a strategic plan moving forward of how Canada would like to see this move forward would bring some more credibility. On the North Korean front, we're already there. The NEON operations that Canada's engaged in to prevent sanctions invasions is well respected by the Japanese and the South Koreans, and they would like more of it. So how can we do more of those kinds of activities to help with the denuclearization process, the Korean Peninsula? I think that there's a real role for Canada to work between Japan and Korea in terms of fostering new trilateral formulas of cooperation to deal with either its historical issues or to provide another platform for the three countries to cooperate. The Taiwan issue I mentioned before, I think that we need to continue to demonstrate that we are providing credible resources to ensure that the peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. That may be diplomatic resources, is working with the Japanese, within the G7 context, with the Taiwanese, to say that we support peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. Perhaps enhancing the deterrence capabilities, enhancing their diplomatic capabilities so that they can be a more effective player on the international community. I also mentioned the paucity of institutions within the region. And I think here, what I mean by this is, the Indo-Pacific region is very heterogeneous, lots of different kinds of economies, lots of different kinds of political systems. Some countries are very developed, some countries are not developed. So how can we get these countries to cooperate? So trade agreements is one, contributing on infrastructure and connectivity is another, and we can do this bilaterally or multilaterally. It could be through enhancing the resilience of supply chains by working again within the pre-existing resilient supply chain initiative between India and Australia and Japan, or offering new initiatives to try and, again, create more resilience and more institutionalization of the region so that it's more stable. So I don't think this is brain surgery. Rather, I think it's thinking about how we use our resources effectively. And maybe lastly on this, Josh, I think I would really like to see the government invest in educating strategic thinkers and thinkers that have experience in the Indo-Pacific region. We need China experts, of course. We need Japan experts, of course. But I think we need regional experts. And this means investing in our universities and in programs that give language training, the opportunity to go study abroad, deep insight in terms of grand strategy and strategic thinking, great power politics, with an area studies approach. And I can't tell you how important I think this is. And I often look at kinds of job postings exist in Canada, and the kinds of university faculty that universities are recruiting are not on great power politics or grand strategy or Indo-Pacific studies or China studies and Japan studies. They are very, very, very culturally related. So the progressive cultural issues, which are important, but again, I don't think it's preparing Canada for this region when we don't have experts that can really engage not just in one country, but in the region at a regional level.
China's post-pandemic rebound hasn't necessarily materialized. It faces mounting economic obstacles, declining trade, declining foreign investments, and a shaky housing market. What are the ripple effects of a potentially faltering Chinese economy on Canada's economic well-being, especially considering supply chains, trade relationships, and socioeconomic impacts that can cascade through the international system? And how can Canada address the challenges this could pose to us?
So you're right. China's facing some real serious economic headwinds. Some of them are structural, associated with demographic issues. And basically all the infrastructure that could have been built to create jobs can no longer sustain the economy. The property market is in real trouble. I think the COVID-19 policies, the zero COVID, has really fractured the confidence of ordinary Chinese citizens to be consumers, to invest. And as a result, the economy may be entering a long-term period of deflation. Deflation means they don't consume as much, property prices decrease, and this means that they may not be as active consumers of Canadian products, whether it's agricultural or otherwise. And this will impact, I think, the Canadian economy. So what can Canada do? I think that Canada continues to need to find the comparative advantages that probably won't be affected by these issues. So I think Western Canada is particularly well situated to be, again, an agricultural superpower. And here, I think the Canada West Foundation does some great work. And you could find, if your listeners are interested in this, you can find a lot of great data there about how Western Canada has continued to benefit from the trade relationship, despite the terrible relations between Canada and China, and despite the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that we need to be, again, thinking about diversifying our trade within the region. So, Japan's a great partner, South Korea, Southeast Asia, perhaps India. So, this means changing our economic portfolio so we're not so dependent on the Chinese economy. But that doesn't mean decouple. That doesn't mean we don't invest in China, but we try to ensure that we're diversifying in a way so that we're less susceptible to the structural downturn in the Chinese economy. The geopolitics between the United States and China will further slow the economy. At least that's my expectation. The CHIPS Act that will limit technology and dual-use technology will further slow the economy. And the question is which businesses that Canada can engage in China that don't fall within these categories, and will U.S. policies towards China make Canadian businesses, bystanders or victims of U.S. foreign policy towards China? And I think that we need to be much more aware of that. And lastly, I think again, strengthening our relations within NAFTA 2.0 is also important. And this means really focusing on our comparative advantages, our technology, our education, so that we can benefit from NAFTA 2.0, so that again, that this market continues to grow and deepen, and Canada continues to be a critical partner to allow for us to prosper. And I want to go back to that point. It's crazy not to use our energy and critical mineral comparative advantages to add value to the region, but also to ensure that the slowdown in China doesn't affect the prosperity of Canadian interests. And that goes to any engagement within the region. We need to have national interests, and we try to achieve those national interests based on a strategy. And I think not using those resources would be, it's not in our national interests.
How can Canada grapple with the challenges posed by China, Russia, and a potentially less reliable, more inward-looking United States?
Well, there are different challenges, obviously. So I think that our approach needs to be different. And, there's a challenge to the relationship with China, the challenge to the relationship with Russia, and the challenge to the relationship with the United States. Let's start with the U.S. I think that we need to continue to build strong government to state relations, province to state relations, so that the best advocates for Canada will be state governors, and they'll be speaking to political leaders in the White House and in Congress. So that's going to be really, really important moving forward to stabilize the relationship, is to continue to build those really strong province to state and government to state relations to insulate us from some of the political challenges that are going to come as the United States work out the political challenges they're facing with regards to the former occupant of the White House and the current occupant of the White House. Over the long term, the relationship is going to continue to be one that's complementary within the NAFTA 2.0 context. We share many, many, many values with the United States, and many of our families are cross-border. So I think that we need to continue to invest in that relationship, as I mentioned. The Russian relationship is somewhat more complex in that, of course, Putin's Russia has invaded a sovereign state, is using force to try to change the region's security architecture and really reshape how Europe thinks about security. I think it's in Canada's interest to ensure that the EU remains robust, that the NATO continues to expand, and that it incorporates the Ukraine into NATO. And I'm saying this not so much from the point of defending Ukraine from Russia. I think in the post-Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we need to be conscious that Ukraine needs to be and develop its military and security within the context of NATO, so it follows NATO's norms, NATO's laws, NATO's rules, so that the most well-armed state right now in Europe really is a state that is following rules and is not corrupt to maintain stability. And dealing with Russia over the long term, we need to find a way to re-engage with Russia. It won't be under Putin. That's my observation. We need to find a way to work with it, incorporate it into the European family in some way, and to de-escalate the nationalism that has emerged in Russia. It's a long-term project, and we're going to have to work with Europe. And lastly, on the China front, it's been around for 2,000-3,000 years. It will be around for another 2,000 or 3,000 years. It's not going away. It's going to be the second largest economy, if it's not already the largest economy. And it's going to have a significant economic, diplomatic, and political sway. And we need to find ways to work with China and likely accept that it's going to be a one-party state for some time, and it will share very different political values. But that doesn't mean we don't find ways to constructively work with China when we can, but again, create resilience within our system so we're not susceptible to political interference campaigns, so that our Chinese Canadian citizens are not manipulated by political interference or WeChat misinformation campaigns. So it's a complex engagement process that will take government, but it will also take us working with like-minded countries and countries that have deep experience. And as I mentioned with the education comment earlier, we need to seriously invest in the skills of young people so that they can engage not only with China, but the region broadly, so that we're better able to negotiate the challenges of China moving forward.
My final question of this marathon interview, Stephen, is it realistic to expect that cooperative and mutually beneficial economic relations can be maintained with China while also addressing concerns about political interference and coercive diplomacy?
Well, I think that there's room for a public discussion about political interference in Canada, but it has to be done in a disciplined and open manner. At the same time, I think that as we try to address the issues of political interference, that we don't want to reveal all our cards, how we detected political interference, so that the Chinese know how we figured out how they did it, and then they change their tactics, and then they do it in a different way. So as we think about first addressing these issues, I think there's a place for the public discussion, but there's a place also for dealing this behind closed doors so that we can continue to have effective policies to identify these issues. We need to be mature in our approach and understand that a bilateral relationship of this magnitude has many dimensions, and that if we only focus on the one dimension, political interference, that we're going to lose salience in the other dimensions of the relationship. So that means that we find ways to isolate different aspects of the relationship so that they don't overlap with others. And this is extremely, extremely difficult. But I think that it's something that we continue to need to focus on. And again, I think that good ways to do this is to work in multilateral partnerships to demonstrate to China that these kinds of tactics will have consequences on China, whether they're economic or political, and that to try and discourage or de-incentivize using these tactics to shape our political system. There's no easy solution, but it's critical that we continue to try and find ways to deal with this.
Well, Stephen, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being so generous with your time. It's been a privilege having you on, and I look forward to future engagements with you. So thank you. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next time.